Right, so ladies and gentlemen, I've returned to Whitechapel to round up this story about the Jack the Ripper murders. And what I'm doing at the present moment, where we started out in Whitechapel High Street and Aldgate High Street, I'm looking now west towards the City of London, and as I turn round, I now look out east towards Altab Alley Park and towards Whitechapel generally. And turning further round, this is the commercial street. But we're not going to go down here. What I propose to do is cross over the road at this point, and I'm going to talk about the aftermath of the murders, what we call the canonical murders. And the question, of course, the last one of these was the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, which took place on the 9th of November, 1888. And the question then is that the last one? That was certainly the gruesome climax that took place.
Almost entirely.
Was it the last of the murders? Well, again, like so much about the Jack the Ripper murders, we just don't know. Can't really produce a definitive answer to that question. Of course, women were having their throats cut and there were prostitutes getting murdered way after the murder of Mary Kelly. And two names actually stand out in this. There's Alice McKenzie, who was murdered in July of 1889, and I'll talk a bit more about her. There's also a lady called Frances Coles, who was murdered in 1892, but that's some distance from here, and I think I'm going to focus on Alice McKenzie. So what had happened was we had the murder of Mary Kelly, and that was on Friday the 9th of November. And after that, the police were saying, well, were there any more murders taking place? They had suicide. A man called Druitt, who threw himself into the River Thames. His body was fished out of the River Thames on, I think it was New Year's Eve. And it was just convenient to say that after the last murder, he was so overwhelmed with his grief and remorse he couldn't bear to live with himself, and he threw himself into the River Thames, and that was the end of him. And after that, there were no more Ripper murders. There's also another man the police picked up. They didn't really have his name. They called him David Cohen. He was Jewish. He was known to be mentally unhinged, and he could also be extremely violent. Anyway, the police picked him up and put him into a psychiatric institution, since they couldn't convict him with anything. And he died in the spring of 1889. So after that, I think the police were really quite satisfied that they had the murders were over. But were they? That's a good question. I'm going to turn around now in. We've come to Old Castle Street, because a murder took place here in July 1889, and I'm going to talk a bit about that one, because there are very strong links with the murders that have gone on before, although of course it is really just an anti-climax. So this is Old Castle Street, no doubt named after the Old Castle pub, and you can see directly ahead of us, ahead of us we have the sign indicating that the buildings on the left are part of London Metropolitan University. And we'll just make our way down here. Now, Alice McKenzie, what we do know about her, she was born in 1849 in Peterborough. And we know that she, or at least we think we know, that she came down to London in 1874, and she took up with a man called Joseph McCormack, 1883, and she lived Oh, should I say, at the time of her murder, she was living in a doss house, a common lodging house in Gun Street. And that's very close to the neighbourhood that I was talking about. The place where Mary Kelly and Annie Chapman were living. So I'm just making my way down here, and the murder took place outside the wash houses, which were built in 1846. And this is now, can you see it up there? Wash house. This is a place where people used to come and wash. Wash themselves, wash their clothes, keep clean. I had no other way of doing it. Many of them didn't have running water in those days. But anyway, what do we know about the murder of Alice McKenzie, sometimes known as Claypipe Alice, because of her predilection to smoke pipes, which was unusual for a woman in those days. Anyway, rather daring perhaps. Anyway, Tuesday the 16th of July, 1889, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She was living, as I say, in Gun Street with a lady called Elizabeth Ryder, who was her landlady. She was living there with McCormack, Miss Joseph McCormack, who used to work. He was employed by Jewish tailors in Hanbury Street as a porter. Anyway, Joseph McCormack paid Alice McKenzie 1 shilling and 8pence to pay the rent and another shilling for necessities. And so it was recorded that she left the house. She didn't pay the rent, but she left with the money. And that was at 4, so we didn't know for another 4 hours what she was doing. At 8:30, that's over 4.5 hours later, Elizabeth Ryder, the landlady, although I suppose you call her the deputy of the house, saw Alice more or less drunk, and she observed that she was having an argument with Joseph McCormack, and then Alice left the house. So she left the house at 8:30, 9:30, 10:30, 11:30. That's 3 hours. 11:40, Alice was seen talking to friends in Flower and Dean Street. And after that, we had midnight, and then after midnight, quarter of an hour after midnight, a police officer called Joseph Allen came into Castle Alley, as it was then called, and he didn't see anything at all. So that's it's interesting. He didn't see anything. Actually, he came in here to take a bite of a sandwich, which he shouldn't have been doing. Actually, that was against the regulations he was working under. But anyway, that was 12:15. 5 minutes later, 12:20, another police officer. His name was Walter Andrews. He came along here, and he was also satisfied that nothing was going on. And then at 1:45, that's 12:45, it started to rain. Now, here again, 5 minutes later, 12:50, the bodies of a woman was discovered on that pavement. I shall cross over the road, just down here, find out more about these wash houses. Body of a woman was discovered somewhere around here, not far. 2 stabs in the neck, and her skirts had been lifted up. The body was under the pavement under the body was dry, and therefore it indicates that the murder must have taken place sometime before the rain had started, so it must have been very, very recent. Anyway, the body was discovered by PC Walter Andrews on a return journey. He was sent to his chief, Inspector Edmund Reed, who arrived with Dr. George Bagster Phillips to examine what the nature of the murder, and he decided that the death had taken place from the severance of the left carotid artery. And this is all in line with the sort of murders that took place by Jack the Ripper. There were 2 stabs, leaving jagged wounds in the neck. Again, that's Jack the Ripper's method of operation. There were bruising of the chest, so quite clearly Alice McKenzie's murderer had held Alice McKenzie down. And after that there was a 7-inch cut to the navel pointing down towards the groin, and a small cut on her sexual organs. Now again, that indicates it wasn't nearly as badly mutilated as the other victims, but clearly the murderer must have had an interest in that particular part of the body. So we'll move on now and see where we can just go down to the end of Old Castle Street. Dr. Thomas Bond, who conducted the post-mortem on Mary Kelly, also conducted the post-mortem on Alice McKenzie. And I mean, that's very interesting because he is a very methodical and detailed man. And what he said of it was that I see in this murder evidence of a similar design to the former Whitechapel murders. Get off the road. Oh, there's somebody coming by. A sudden onslaught on the prostrate woman, the throat skillfully and resolutely cut with subsequent mutilation, each mutilation indicating sexual thoughts and the desire to mutilate the sexual organs. I'm of the opinion that the murder was performed by the same person who committed the former series of Whitechapel murders. So that meant that he thought that this was another Ripper murder. Not everybody agreed with him though. Robert Anderson, who was actually on holiday at the time, he always seemed to be on holiday whenever these important events take place, and not really his fault, I mean he'd booked to go on the holiday. He disagreed. He was the man who later thought the murder was a mad Jewish man. There were other senior police officers who disagreed with Bond, but I have a lot of respect for Bond. I think, as I say, he did a very good job on Mary Kelly's post-mortem. So I listen to what he has to say, or listen what he has to read. Now what we're doing is we're coming to the end of Old Castle Street and we're in Wentworth Street, and I haven't been at exactly this point, but if we look up this way we go across Commercial Street, and further up Commercial Street we have the area which we've already covered, and I've covered it before for the murder of Martha Tabram. That's all in that direction. Let's come round here. Right, so in 1894 there was attacks on women by a man called Cutbush, who used to creep up behind women with a sharp knife and slash their skirts. That's all he did. He just used to, I mean, there's some people like that. He just used to creep up behind women and slash their skirts. Don't forget that, of course, Victorian fashions, these Victorian skirts were very wide and sort of readily open to being slashed by knives. But it just shows you that you had these lunatics about, and it was the fact that you had this man Cutbush who started going on this activity. People thought, is this man Jack the Ripper? He started up again, and it was Melvin Macnaghten who wrote a memorandum for the benefit of the Sun newspaper to say, no, this wasn't Jack the Ripper, not really his. I mean, why would you? If the only thing the man does is go around slashing skirts, it's not something very pleasant, but nevertheless, it's just not really Jack the Ripper style. We're in Galston Street, ladies and gentlemen. We've been here before, and as you can see, there's a little market up here, and coming up Galston Street, we've come to the site where the piece of cloth was thrown aside when the murderer finished with Catherine Eddowes. So here we are. This is the restaurant. I could end up here. This is Happy Days restaurant. I'm delighted to end up here. You've got a takeaway place, but this is the restaurant. So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. It's all a bit of an anti-climax after Mary Kelly. And I say, after this, the story goes on and on. There are other people whose names come up. But the question is then, what happened to Jack the Ripper? Did he just stop? Well, Edward Stowe is of the opinion that Jack the Ripper just stopped. And in fact, to be fair to Edward Stowe, there are people who do just stop. Some people just can't help themselves. I'm of the opinion, actually, that Jack the Ripper, if somebody who committed the murder of Mary Kelly was really possessed by demons and simply could not stop. But anyway, that is really just my opinion, and I won't be dogmatic on that point. So what was the end of Jack the Ripper? I think he just stepped backwards into the street and inadvertently, and he fell underneath the hooves of the horse of a travelling milk van. Well, maybe. I don't know, ladies and gentlemen. That's the best explanation I can give, and I think actually the story will go on and on and on for a little while yet to come. But I'm going to finish now in Galston Street, and what I'll do is see you again in another video about Commercial Street.